I watched the frost creep across my garage window as the thermometer hit -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and I knew this was going to be the coldest week Minnesota had seen in decades. But what I didn't know was that Brenda Patterson from the HOA board was about to make a decision that would leave her begging at my doorstep 3 days later. My name is James Walker, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Duluth for almost 6 years. The place wasn't fancy, just a modest development of 200 homes built in the early 2000s, each one looking slightly different but still following the strict architectural guidelines laid out by our overzealous homeowners association. I worked as an automotive technician at a local shop, and my garage had become my sanctuary over the years. I had converted half of it into a proper workspace where I could tinker with engines, do side jobs for extra cash, and generally escape from the world. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late January. I had just finished my breakfast and was heading out to warm up my truck when I noticed Brenda's silver sedan parked in front of my house. She was standing in my driveway with 2 other board members, Carol Henderson and Robert Martinez, all bundled up in expensive winter coats that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Good morning, James," Brenda called out, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She was 52, with short blonde hair that she kept in that classic Karen cut, and she had that particular tone in her voice that immediately put me on edge. I had dealt with her before over various petty violations, like the time my garbage can was visible from the street for an extra 2 hours after pickup, or when she claimed my lawn was a 1/4 inch too long. "Morning," I replied, not bothering to hide my lack of enthusiasm. "What can I do for you?" "We're doing our monthly property inspections," Robert said, holding up a clipboard. He was a thin man in his late 50s who always seemed uncomfortable when Brenda dragged him along on these power trips. "Just routine stuff." I crossed my arms. "My property is fine, same as it was last month." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "We'll be the judge of that. We received a complaint about an electrical cord running from your garage." My stomach dropped. She was talking about the heavy-duty extension cord I had running from my garage to the outdoor outlet on the side of my house. I had set it up 3 days ago when the weather forecast predicted this brutal cold snap. The cord powered a space heater I kept in my garage to prevent my pipes from freezing and to keep my workspace at least minimally functional. "That's a temporary setup for the cold weather," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "The garage isn't on the central heating system, and I need to keep the temperature above freezing or my pipes will burst. It's a safety measure." Carol, a heavy-set woman with graying hair, flipped through a thick binder. "According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenants, no external electrical cords are permitted to be visible from the street or neighboring properties for more than 24 hours. "You're kidding me," I said, feeling my face flush despite the cold. "It's -15 degrees. The weather service is saying it's going to get down to -25 tonight. This is a matter of protecting my property." Brenda pulled out her phone and snapped several pictures of the extension cord where it ran along the side of my garage. "Rules are rules, James. If we make exceptions for you, we'll have to make exceptions for everyone. The neighborhood will turn into a chaotic mess of cords and hoses everywhere." "It's one cord and it's barely visible," I protested. "And it's only going to be there for a few days until this cold snap passes." "You have until 5 o'clock this evening to remove it," Brenda said, her tone brooking no argument. "If it's still there after that, you'll receive a fine of $250 per day until it's removed." I felt my jaw clench. "And what am I supposed to do about keeping my garage from freezing?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. Maybe you could run a cord inside the garage. Or use a battery-powered heater. A battery-powered heater strong enough to keep a garage above freezing in this weather doesn't exist, I said flatly. And I can't run a cord inside because the only outlet with enough amperage is the external one. The internal outlets aren't rated for the heater I'm using. Brenda was already walking back to her car. Figure it out, James. 5 o'clock deadline. Have a nice day. I stood there in my driveway, watching them drive away, my hands balled into fists inside my coat pockets. This was exactly the kind of petty tyranny that made HOAs the bane of homeowners everywhere. I went back inside and immediately started researching my options. I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants and read through Section 12 multiple times, looking for any loopholes or exceptions. There was a provision for temporary electrical usage during emergencies, but it required pre-approval from the board, and given Brenda's attitude, I knew that was a non-starter. I called my buddy Mike, who was an electrician, and explained the situation. "Man, that's rough," he said. "I could come out and install an interior outlet with the right amperage, but that's going to take at least a few days to schedule and complete. And it won't be cheap. You're looking at maybe $800 minimum." I thanked him and hung up, feeling trapped. I couldn't afford to pay daily fines that would quickly spiral into thousands of dollars. But I also couldn't afford to let my pipes freeze, which would cause damage that could easily cost $10,000 or more to repair. At 4:30 that afternoon, I was still trying to figure out a solution when I heard a vehicle pull up outside. I looked out the window and felt my blood run cold. Brenda was back, but this time she had brought Dennis Harper, the HOA's property manager, and they were walking straight toward my garage with a pair of bolt cutters. I rushed outside. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brenda pointed at my extension cord. "It's after 5 o'clock in Mountain Time, which means your deadline has passed. We're removing the code violation ourselves." "It's 4:30, I said, pulling out my phone to show her the time. "And we're in the Central Time Zone, not Mountain. You can't just come onto my property and destroy my things." Dennis, a burly man in his 40s with a thick beard, shook his head. "Actually, the HOA covenants give us the right to enter any property to remedy violations that pose a safety or aesthetic concern. External cords are considered both." "That's insane," I said, moving to block their path. "You're going to cause thousands of dollars in damage to my property by removing that heater during a dangerous cold snap. I could sue you for that." Brenda's expression was pure ice. "You can try. But you signed the covenants when you purchased your home. Now please step aside, or we'll call the police for interfering with HOA business." I knew I was beaten in that moment. If I physically stopped them, I'd be the one getting arrested. If I let them unplug my heater, I'd be facing frozen pipes and massive damage. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "For the record," I said clearly, making sure my phone captured both their faces and the extension cord, "I am formally protesting this action. The temperature is currently -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a forecasted low of -25 tonight. Removing this heater will directly result in frozen pipes and significant property damage. I am stating clearly that the HOA will be liable for any and all damages that result from this action." Brenda barely glanced at my phone. "Noted. Dennis, proceed." I watched helplessly as Dennis walked to where my extension cord connected to the outdoor outlet and simply unplugged it. He didn't even need the bolt cutters. He coiled up the cord and handed it to Brenda like a trophy. "We'll return this to you in 7 days, Brenda said. "That should be after this cold weather passes. If you run the cord again before then, the fine will increase to $500 per day." They left, and I stood there in the rapidly darkening evening, watching my breath crystallize in the air. I went into my garage and felt the temperature already starting to drop. The space heater sat silent and useless. I had other space heaters in my house, but none of them were powerful enough, and I didn't have another heavy-duty extension cord that could reach the outlet. I spent the next hour calling every hardware store within 20 miles. Most were already closed due to the extreme cold warning that had been issued. The two that were still open had sold out of heavy-duty extension cords and high-powered space heaters days ago, as everyone prepared for the cold snap. By 9 o'clock that night, the temperature in my garage had dropped to 35 degrees. By midnight, it was at 20 degrees. I had dragged every blanket I owned out to wrap around the exposed pipes, but I knew it was a losing battle. The temperature outside had hit minus 22 degrees, and the wind chill made it feel like minus 40. I barely slept that night, getting up every hour to check the garage. At 5 in the morning, I heard the sound I'd been dreading, a sharp crack followed by the hiss of water. One of the pipes had frozen and burst. I rushed to shut off the water main, but the damage was done. Water had sprayed across my garage, already starting to freeze into sheets of ice on the concrete floor. When the sun finally rose, I surveyed the damage in the pale winter light. The burst pipe would need to be completely replaced, and the water damage had ruined several boxes of personal items I had stored in the garage. I took extensive photos and videos of everything, documenting every detail. I called my insurance company, and after a long conversation, they informed me that while they would cover the pipe repair, my deductible was $1,500. They also noted that if the HOA's actions had directly caused the damage, I should pursue compensation from them rather than filing a claim that would raise my premiums. That morning, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, detailing the damage and demanding that they cover all repair costs. I sent it via certified mail and email, making sure I had proof of delivery. I also called a plumber, who told me he was completely booked up with emergency calls from the cold snap, but could fit me in 3 days later. In the meantime, I had to keep my house heated and prevent any more pipes from bursting. My heating bill was going to be astronomical, but I had no choice. I cranked up the thermostat and left cabinet doors open to let warm air circulate around the pipes. 2 days later, I received a response from the HOA. It was a form letter signed by Brenda, denying any liability and stating that I had been properly warned about the violation and chose not to comply. The letter also included a bill for $250 for the emergency remediation service they had provided by unplugging my cord. I was furious, but I forced myself to think strategically. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Patricia Mills, and she had a reputation for not backing down from bullying boards. "You have a solid case," Patricia told me after reviewing all my documentation. The HOA's actions were reckless and directly caused significant property damage. However, litigation is expensive and time-consuming. My retainer alone is $3,000, and a case like this could easily cost you $10,000 to $15,000 in legal fees, even if we win. "What are my other options?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair. "You could try to negotiate a settlement with the board. Sometimes the threat of litigation is enough to make them pay up. Or you could file a claim in small claims court, which is cheaper but limits your recovery to around $10,000, depending on Minnesota's limits." I thanked her and left, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I decided to try the negotiation route first. I sent another letter to the board, this time outlining the legal basis for their liability and including Patricia's contact information to show I was serious about pursuing legal action. While all this was happening, the cold snap continued. The temperature had been below -10 for 5 straight days, and the entire city of Duluth was struggling. The news was full of stories about frozen pipes, car troubles, and people staying home from work because it was too dangerous to go outside. On the 6th day, something interesting happened. I was working from home, taking calls for the auto shop and scheduling appointments for when the weather improved when I heard a knock at my door. It was Robert Martinez from the HOA board, and he looked uncomfortable. "James, do you have a minute?" he asked, his voice apologetic. I let him in, curious about what he wanted. He stood awkwardly in my entryway, stamping snow off his boots. "I want to apologize," he said. "I didn't agree with what Brenda did. I told her it was a bad idea to unplug your heater during a cold snap like this, but she insisted we had to enforce the rules uniformly." "Then why didn't you vote against it?" I asked, not bothering to hide my anger. He sighed. "Because Brenda controls the board. She has Carol wrapped around her finger, and the two of them always vote together. I'm the odd man out on most decisions. I've been thinking about resigning, honestly." "That doesn't help me," I said. "I've got thousands of dollars in damage and an HOA that refuses to take responsibility." Robert nodded. "I know. That's actually why I'm here. I wanted to warn you that Brenda is planning to escalate things. She's talking about putting a lien on your property if you don't pay the remediation fee." I felt my temper flare. "She unplugged my heater and caused my pipes to burst, and now she wants to put a lien on my house for the privilege. I'm going to vote against it," Robert said quickly. "But with just my vote, it'll still pass 2-1. I thought you should know what's coming." After he left, I immediately called Patricia Mills back and told her about the threatened lien. She assured me that we could fight it, but it would require legal action. I was beginning to realize that Brenda wasn't going to back down, and this was going to get much worse before it got better. The 7th day of the cold snap arrived, and that morning, something changed. I woke up to frantic knocking on my door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Brenda standing there, and she looked completely different from her usual composed self. Her face was red from the cold, and there was genuine panic in her eyes. "James, I need your help," she said, her voice strained. "My car won't start. None of our cars will start. The whole board has been trying since 6 this morning, and nothing works." I leaned against the door frame, processing this. "Your car won't start in -20-degree weather. That's strange." "Please," she said, and I could hear the desperation now. "I know we've had our differences, but I need to get to work. Carol and Dennis both need to get to work too. Robert said you're an automotive technician and that you might be able to help us." I looked at her for a long moment, remembering how she had stood in my driveway just 7 days ago and unplugged my heater despite my warnings. I thought about the burst pipe, the water damage, the stress, and the thousands of dollars this was going to cost me. "That's a tough situation," I said finally. "Unfortunately, I'm not really available to help right now." Her eyes widened. "What? But you work on cars for a living. Surely you could just take a quick look." "I could," I agreed, "but I'm dealing with some property damage issues right now. A pipe burst in my garage, and I've been pretty busy handling that. You know how it is when you have to deal with unexpected problems." The color drained from her face as she realized what I was saying. "James, please. I'm sorry about the heater situation, but this is different. This is an emergency." "You're right, it is an emergency," I said. "Kind of like how it was an emergency when my pipes were at risk of freezing." Unfortunately, emergencies don't always get the response we hope for, do they? Are you seriously going to be petty about this? She demanded, some of her usual imperious tone returning. I felt a cold anger settle over me. Petty. You unplugged my heater during the worst cold snap in decades. My pipes burst, and you sent me a bill for the privilege. Now you want me to drop everything and help you. No, I'm declining your request for assistance. I could report you to your employer, Brenda threatened. Tell them you're refusing to help customers. Go ahead, I said calmly. You're not a customer. You're a member of the HOA board that's currently refusing to pay for the damage you caused to my property, and I'm not obligated to work on anyone's car outside of my job. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some phone calls to make to contractors. I started to close the door, but she put her hand out to stop it. Wait, what if we agreed to cover your pipe repair costs? Would you help us then? I pretended to consider it. That's an interesting offer. But you'd need to put it in writing, and I'd need to have my lawyer review it. That'll take a few days at least. A few days, she said, her voice rising. I need to get to work today. I have an important meeting this afternoon. Then I suggest you call a tow truck and have your car taken to a shop, I said. Although I should warn you, every shop in the city is probably backed up with dead batteries and frozen engines right now. You're looking at maybe a week's wait, possibly longer. Brenda's face went through several shades of red. This is ridiculous. You're being completely unreasonable. No, I said firmly. I'm being exactly as reasonable as you were when you unplugged my heater. Have a good day, Brenda. I closed the door and listened to her storm off my porch, muttering angrily. Through my window, I watched her try to start her car again, turning the key over and over while the engine refused to turn over. After several minutes, she gave up and pulled out her phone, presumably to call for a tow truck or a ride. About an hour later, Carol Henderson showed up at my door. She was more polite than Brenda had been, but her request was the same. Her car was dead, and she desperately needed to get to her job at a bank across town. I'm sorry, Carol, but I'm not available to help, I told her. I've got too much going on with the damage to my garage. Brenda told me you wanted payment for the pipe repair, Carol said. I think that's fair. We probably should have been more careful about the timing of enforcing that rule. Probably, I repeated. Carol, you stood right there while Brenda unplugged my heater. You didn't say a word about how dangerous it was. You just nodded along and let it happen. She had the grace to look ashamed. You're right. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry. I appreciate the apology, I said, but it doesn't change my current situation. I'm dealing with expensive repairs and an HOA that sent me a bill instead of taking responsibility. So no, I'm not going to help with your car. She tried to argue for a few more minutes, but I remained firm. Eventually, she left too, pulling out her phone to call someone for a ride. Dennis Harper was the third to show up, and he was the least pleasant of all. He didn't bother with apologies or offers of payment. He simply demanded that I come fix his car immediately. I'm the property manager for this HOA, he said. I have the authority to fine you for refusing to assist in a community emergency. I actually laughed at that. A community emergency. Your car won't start. That's a personal problem, not a community emergency. And you can't fine me for refusing to do work that I'm not obligated to do. We'll see about that, he growled and stomped off. By early afternoon, I had received calls and messages from several other residents in the neighborhood. Apparently, the cold snap had killed batteries and caused problems with multiple vehicles, and word had spread that I was an auto mechanic. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have helped at least some of them. I'd done side jobs for neighbors before and had a reputation as someone who was fair and reliable. But these weren't normal circumstances. Every time my phone rang, I thought about Brenda's smug expression as she unplugged my heater. I thought about the sound of my pipe bursting at 5 in the morning. I thought about the bill they'd sent me for emergency remediation. So I declined every request. Some people were understanding when I explained that I was dealing with property damage. Others were less sympathetic, particularly those who were friends with Brenda or other board members. By the evening of that 7th day, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that at least 15 cars in Meadowbrook estates were completely dead. The extreme cold had drained batteries, frozen fuel lines, and caused various other mechanical problems. The local towing companies and repair shops were completely overwhelmed, with wait times stretching into weeks. Several people had started complaining loudly about me on the neighborhood social media pages. There were posts calling me selfish, unprofessional, and vindictive. A few people defended me, pointing out that the HOA had caused significant damage to my property and that I wasn't obligated to help anyone on my personal time. The arguments in the comments sections got heated. People started bringing up other grievances with the HOA, and suddenly, my situation became a flashpoint for all the accumulated resentment that had been building in the neighborhood. Stories came out about other petty enforcement actions, unreasonable fines, and Brenda's generally authoritarian approach to running the board. On the 8th day, the temperature finally started to rise. It was still below zero, but the forecast showed a warming trend coming. More importantly, my plumber finally arrived to assess the burst pipe. "This is exactly what happens when pipes freeze," he confirmed. "The pipe expanded and cracked in multiple places. I'm going to need to replace this entire section, and I'll need to check all your other pipes to make sure there's no additional damage." "How much are we talking?" I asked. He sucked air through his teeth. "Parts and labor, you're probably looking at around $2,500. Could be more if I find other problems." I felt sick, but I told him to proceed with the repairs. While he worked, I documented everything with photos and videos, making sure I had clear evidence of the extent of the damage. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It was a formal notice that they were proceeding with placing a lien on my property for non-payment of the $250 remediation fee, plus an additional $500 in late fees and administrative costs. They gave me 30 days to pay before the lien would be filed. That was it. I tried to be reasonable, tried to give them a chance to make things right, but they were escalating instead. I called Patricia Mills and told her I wanted to move forward with legal action. "I'm ready to file suit," I said. "For the property damage, for their negligent enforcement of the rules, and to block this lien they're threatening." "All right," Patricia said. "I'll draft the complaint. This is going to get expensive, James. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I'm sure," I said. "They need to learn that they can't just bully people and destroy their property without consequences." Over the next few days, Patricia worked on the legal documents while I gathered every piece of evidence I had. I had photos of the extension cord before they unplugged it, videos of them actually doing it, documentation of the weather conditions, photos of the burst pipe and water damage, copies of all my correspondence with the HOA, and a detailed accounting of all my costs. The temperature continued to rise, and by day 10, it was finally above zero for the first time in over a week. The city started to return to normal, though many people were still dealing with the aftermath of the cold snap. I was in my garage, cleaning up after the plumber had finished the repairs when Robert Martinez stopped by again. "I heard you're suing the HOA," he said. "Word travels fast," I replied, continuing to sweep up debris. "Brenda is freaking out," Robert said. She's been calling emergency board meetings, talking about countersuing you, all kinds of things. Carol is starting to have second thoughts about the whole situation." I stopped sweeping and looked at him. "Robert, why are you telling me this?" He met my eyes. "Because I think you're right. What we did was wrong. Brenda was so focused on enforcing the rules that she didn't think about the consequences, and now she's doubling down instead of admitting the mistake. So resign from the board," I said. "Stop enabling her." "I'm planning to," he said. "But I wanted you to know that not everyone on the board supports what happened, and I'm going to testify on your behalf if this goes to court." That was unexpected. "You do that?" "Yeah," he said. "I've been on this board for 3 years, and I've watched Brenda turn it into her personal fiefdom. Maybe your lawsuit will finally force some changes around here." 2 days later, Patricia filed the lawsuit in Duluth County District Court. We were suing the HOA for $25,000, which included the cost of the pipe repairs, water damage to my personal property, increased heating bills during the cold snap, emotional distress, and punitive damages for their reckless conduct. The HOA had to be formally served with the lawsuit, and I made sure I was watching from my window when the process server showed up at Brenda's house. The look on her face when she answered the door and received the documents was priceless. Within hours, my phone started ringing. It was Brenda, but I didn't answer. She left a voicemail demanding that I call her immediately to discuss this absurd lawsuit. I deleted it and went about my day. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA's lawyer, a man named Gerald Foster. He requested a meeting to discuss the possibility of settling the dispute without litigation. Patricia advised me to accept the meeting, so we scheduled it for the following week. In the meantime, something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. The local newspaper got wind of the story. A reporter named Susan Drake called me and asked if she could interview me about the lawsuit. Apparently, someone had tipped her off, and she was interested in doing a story about HOA overreach. I agreed to the interview, figuring that public pressure might help my case. Susan came to my house, and I showed her the garage, the repaired pipe, and all my documentation. I explained exactly what had happened, step by step, making sure to stick to the facts. The article came out 3 days later, and it was prominently featured in the local news section. The headline read, "Homeowner sues HOA after board unplugs heater, causing thousands in damage." The article was balanced but clearly presented the facts in a way that made the HOA look bad. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story got picked up by local TV news stations, and suddenly reporters were showing up in Meadowbrook estates, interviewing residents and asking for comments from the HOA board. Brenda refused to speak to the media, which only made her look worse. The neighborhood social media pages exploded with activity. Many residents who had previously defended the board's actions were now questioning whether they had been too harsh. Others shared their own stories of unreasonable HOA enforcement, and there were calls for Brenda to resign from the board. The meeting with the HOA's lawyer was tense. Gerald Foster was a slick corporate attorney who tried to present the HOA's position as reasonable and my lawsuit as frivolous. Patricia shut him down efficiently, presenting our evidence and making it clear that we had a strong case. "Your client's actions directly caused significant property damage during a well-publicized dangerous weather event," Patricia said. "We have documentation, witness statements, and expert testimony lined up. If this goes to trial, the HOA will lose and the judgment will likely be much higher than what we're asking for now." Gerald conferred with Brenda and the other board members in hushed tones. Finally, he turned back to us. My clients are prepared to offer a settlement of $5,000 to resolve this matter, he said. I almost laughed. That doesn't even cover the pipe repairs, let alone everything else. It's a starting point for negotiations, Gerald said smoothly. Patricia shook her head. No. We're not negotiating from $5,000. Your clients caused at least $10,000 in direct damages, plus additional costs. If you want to settle, come back with a serious offer. The meeting ended without resolution, and I left feeling frustrated but determined. Patricia assured me that this was normal, that the initial settlement offer was always low, and that they'd likely come back with something more reasonable. A week later, something happened that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. I was at work when I got a call from Robert Martinez. His voice was shaking. James, you need to know something. I just found out that Brenda has been embezzling money from the HOA. I nearly dropped my phone. What? I was going through the financial records for the quarterly report, and I noticed some irregularities. Payments to vendors that don't exist, reimbursements for expenses that were never incurred. I dug deeper, and I found evidence that she's been stealing money for at least 2 years. We're talking about maybe $50,000 or $60,000. Holy hell, I said. What are you going to do? I'm reporting it to the other board members and to the police, Robert said. I just wanted you to know because this is going to blow up the whole situation with your lawsuit. He was right. The next day, the news broke that the HOA board president was under investigation for embezzlement. The story made the local news again, and suddenly Meadowbrook Estates was infamous for all the wrong reasons. Brenda was arrested 3 days later. The police had conducted their investigation quickly, and the evidence was apparently overwhelming. She had been creating fake invoices from a shell company and having the HOA pay them, then transferring the money to her personal accounts. She'd covered her tracks well, but not well enough to withstand a forensic audit. The arrest made regional news. Video of Brenda being led out of her house in handcuffs appeared on every local news channel. The reporters all mentioned the lawsuit I had filed, connecting it to the larger story of corruption within the HOA. With Brenda facing criminal charges, the dynamics of my lawsuit changed completely. Carol Henderson resigned from the board immediately, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Dennis Harper was fired as property manager. Robert was left as the only remaining board member, and he had to quickly organize a special election to fill the vacant positions. In the meantime, the HOA's lawyer called Patricia with a new settlement offer. $20,000, a written apology, removal of all fines and fees they had assessed against me, and an agreement to revise the HOA covenants to include reasonable exceptions for emergency situations. Patricia recommended I accept it. You could potentially get more if we go to trial, but this is a solid offer that covers all your damages and then some. Plus, the changes to the covenants will help protect other residents in the future. I agreed, and we settled. The HOA paid me the full amount within 2 weeks, and I received a formal written apology signed by Robert and the HOA's lawyer. The letter acknowledged that their enforcement actions had been inappropriate and had directly caused the damage to my property. The special election for new board members was held a month later. 3 new people were elected, none of whom had been part of Brenda's regime. One of them was actually a neighbor I got along with, a retired teacher named Frank Wilson who had always struck me as reasonable and fair. The new board's first action was to review all of the HOA's rules and enforcement procedures. They created an appeals process for violations, established clear guidelines for emergency exceptions, and instituted financial oversight measures to prevent any future embezzlement. Brenda's criminal case moved through the court system over the following months. I had to testify at one of the preliminary hearings, explaining how the HOA board had operated and what had happened with my heater. The prosecutor used my case as evidence of Brenda's pattern of abuse of power and disregard for residents' well-being. Eventually, Brenda pleaded guilty to embezzlement and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though 2 of those years were suspended contingent on her paying back the stolen money. She was also ordered to pay a fine and complete community service. She lost her house in Meadowbrook Estates and had to move away after serving her time. Carol Henderson never faced criminal charges, but the investigation revealed that she had been willfully ignorant of the financial irregularities. She had signed off on payments without reviewing them properly, too eager to support Brenda to do her due diligence. She ended up moving out of the neighborhood too, embarrassed by the scandal. Dennis Harper found work as a property manager in another city, but his reputation had been damaged by his association with Brenda and his aggressive enforcement tactics. Robert Martinez ended up being something of a hero in the neighborhood. He'd been the one to blow the whistle on the embezzlement, and his testimony was crucial in the criminal case. He stayed on the board for another year before retiring, satisfied that he'd helped reform the HOA into something more reasonable. As for me, I used some of the settlement money to properly insulate my garage and install interior electrical outlets capable of handling high amperage devices. I also invested in a generator backup system for future emergencies. The rest of the money went into my savings account, a nice buffer against future problems. The burst pipe incident became something of a legend in Meadowbrook Estates. New residents would hear the story and shake their heads in disbelief. The rule about external electrical cords was revised to include specific exceptions for extreme weather events, and the new board made it clear that common sense would prevail over strict rule enforcement. My reputation in the neighborhood improved significantly. People who had criticized me on social media apologized, and many admitted that they would have done the same thing in my position. I started getting more side work from neighbors who needed car repairs, and I was known as someone who would stand up to bullying and unfair treatment. About a year after everything happened, Frank Wilson from the HOA board stopped by my house. We'd become friendly over the months, and he occasionally asked my advice on board matters. "I wanted to thank you," he said, sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee. "What you went through was terrible, but it exposed a lot of problems that needed to be fixed. This neighborhood is a much better place now than it was under Brenda's rule." "I appreciate that," I said, "though I wish it hadn't taken a burst pipe and a lawsuit to make it happen." "Sometimes that's what it takes," Frank said. "People get comfortable with the status quo even when it's harmful. It takes someone willing to fight back to create change." We talked for a while longer about various neighborhood matters, and after he left, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The whole ordeal had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. There were moments when I'd wondered if it was worth it, if I should have just paid the fine and moved on. But looking back, I was glad I'd stood my ground. Brenda had been a bully who abused her power, and she'd hurt a lot of people over the years with her petty enforcement actions and tyrannical leadership style. By fighting back, I'd not only protected myself, but helped expose corruption that had been going on for years. The story had an interesting epilogue about 2 years later. I was at a community barbecue that the new HOA board organized every summer when a young couple approached me. They just moved into the neighborhood and had heard about what happened. "We almost didn't buy here because of the reputation this HOA had," the husband said. "But when we researched it, we found out about all the reforms that were made after your lawsuit. That's actually what convinced us this was a good place to live." His wife nodded. "We wanted somewhere with an active HOA that maintained standards, but not somewhere with crazy, power-hungry people making everyone's life miserable. It seems like you guys found a good balance." I smiled, appreciating the irony. "Yeah, it took some work to get here, but it was worth it." As I stood there in the summer sunshine, watching neighbors laugh and kids play in the park area of our subdivision, I thought about that freezing cold day when Brenda had unplugged my heater. At the time, it had seemed like a disaster, an unfair abuse of power that would cost me thousands of dollars and months of stress. But in the end, it had led to real positive change. Brenda was held accountable for her crimes. The HOA was reformed. The neighborhood became a better place to live. And I learned that sometimes the right thing to do is to stand up and fight, even when it's difficult and uncertain. I never forgot the lesson of that brutal cold snap, and neither did anyone else in Meadowbrook Estates. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of checks and balances, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the value of residents who are willing to hold their HOA accountable. Whenever new board members were elected, someone would inevitably bring up the heater incident as a reminder of what could happen when board members prioritized rules over common sense and power over community welfare. It became part of the neighborhood's institutional memory, a shared story that helped define what kind of community we wanted to be. The physical reminder was still visible, too. The outdoor outlet where my extension cord had been plugged in remained, and I occasionally used it for legitimate purposes like power tools or holiday lights. But every time I looked at it, I remembered that frozen January morning when I discovered my burst pipe and the long journey that followed. Life in Meadowbrook Estates settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA functioned the way it was supposed to, maintaining common areas and enforcing reasonable standards without becoming oppressive. Property values actually increased after the scandal because buyers appreciated the reforms that had been implemented. I continued working at the auto shop and doing side jobs for neighbors. My garage, now properly insulated and equipped, became a gathering place sometimes on weekends where guys from the neighborhood would come by to work on their cars or just hang out and talk. On particularly cold winter days, when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind howled across the Minnesota landscape, I'd fire up my properly installed interior heating system and think about how different things could have been. If I just paid that initial fine, Brenda would have continued her reign of petty tyranny. The embezzlement might never have been discovered. The neighborhood would still be under the thumb of someone who cared more about power than people. Instead, I declined to help when their cars died in the cold, and that single decision had set off a chain of events that transformed our entire community. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated, just a moment of standing firm on principle when everything in me wanted to be the bigger person and help anyway. Sometimes being the bigger person means standing your ground. Sometimes it means refusing to enable bad behavior, even when doing so would be easier in the short term. And sometimes, the coldest moments lead to the warmest outcomes. As I locked up my garage that evening after the barbecue and headed into my house, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My home was secure, my property was protected, and my community was thriving. The burst pipe had been repaired, the lawsuit was settled, and justice had been served. And if anyone ever asked me if I regretted declining to help that frigid morning when Brenda knocked on my door with her dead car battery and desperate plea, I could honestly say no. Every choice has consequences, and sometimes the right choice is the hard one, the one that stands on principle, even when compassion pulls you the other way. The temperature that January had dropped to -25 degrees, cold enough to kill car batteries and freeze pipes. But it had also been cold enough to freeze out corruption, to crystallize resolve, and to forge a community that learned to value fairness over blind adherence to rules. That was worth more than any settlement check, more than any apology, more than any single victory in court. It was the knowledge that when tested, I'd stood firm and in doing so had helped create something better for everyone who would come after. The heater cord that Brenda had unplugged sat coiled in my garage, a memento of sorts. I never threw it away, even though I didn't need it anymore. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest consequences, and that standing up to bullies, even petty ones in positions of minor authority, matters more than we might think. Years from now, people would still tell the story of the HOA board president who unplugged a heater and ended up in prison. They'd talk about the homeowner who refused to help when karma came knocking. And they'd remember that in Meadowbrook Estates, we learned the hard way that rules without wisdom are tyranny, and that true community is built on fairness, accountability, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. The cold snap eventually ended, as all winters do. Spring came, then summer, then fall, and the cycle continued. But the changes that bitter cold January brought to our neighborhood never thawed. They became permanent fixtures, foundations of a better way of living together. And every year when winter returned and the temperature dropped, I'd make sure my heating system was working properly, my pipes were protected, and my garage was warm. Not because the HOA required it, but because I'd learned firsthand what happened when you weren't prepared for the cold. The difference was, now I lived in a community where the HOA would actually help residents protect their properties during extreme weather, rather than punishing them for it. And that change, more than anything else, was the real victory that came from the day Brenda Patterson unplugged my heater cord, and I declined to help when all their cars died in the cold.